Donald Harvey was born on April 15, 1952 in Butler, Ohio. Almost immediately after his birth, his parents moved to the small town of Boonville in Kentucky, where he grew up. As a child, he was a favorite of school teachers. They noted that he was always clean and well-dressed, had his hair cut, and often smiled. "Dear boy," the teachers said about him. However, classmates noted that Harvey was not particularly sociable and hurried home at the first opportunity. That's what his peers called him, a house boy. But he did not cause hostility either. After graduating from elementary school in 1968, Harvey entered high school, where teenagers usually decide on their future profession. At this stage, they themselves have the opportunity to choose subjects that you need to know better and make a schedule of classes. But Harvey could not decide who he wanted to become, and after a few months of study he dropped out of school altogether. In 1970, as soon as Harvey turned 18, he decided to start an independent life. He moves to Cincinnati, Ohio, where he gets a job at a local factory as a handyman. But this job is for him. "I got bored quickly. And then my mother called and asked me to visit my grandfather, who was admitted to Marymount Hospital in the town of London in Kentucky." Harvey quits his job and goes to his grandfather. He took such touching care of his grandfather, visited him every day and spent a long time in the hospital, that soon he was offered an official job. So the future. A serial killer became an orderly at Marymount Hospital, where the murderous path of one of the bloodiest maniacs in America began. For several months, Harvey worked very well, and gradually he began to be trusted not only to clean the wards, but also to take care of the sick, check catheters, distribute medications. One night, as Harvey admits much later, he went into the ward of an elderly patient to check the catheter and take out the duct. And the patient quite unexpectedly threw feces in his face. And something clicked in Harvey's brain. "I was outraged that I came to help a person, and he met me like that. It was the last straw. I just lost control of myself."
Hey, I'm not going to beat around the bush. You have to subscribe to the channel and like it so you don't miss new videos.
Pulled a pillow out from under him and strangled him, the killer will tell in 1997 in an interview with the Cincinnati Post newspaper. After the patient stopped showing signs of life, Harvey ran to the shower. He washed himself thoroughly, put on a new robe, and only after that went to the resident's room to report the death of the patient. He said that when he entered the ward, he was already dead. There was no reason for the hospital staff not to believe the diligent nurse. Therefore, death was attributed to natural causes. 3 weeks passed, and Harvey decided to commit another murder. This time the victim was a woman connected to an artificial respiration machine. The orderly turned off the oxygen and watched greedily, behind the agony of the victim. After her death, the serial killer turned on the oxygen again and went to report the death. And this time no one suspected Harvey. And he, feeling impunity, began to get more and more impudent. Over the next year, the maniac killed at least 10 patients at Marymount Hospital. Someone died from suffocation, for which Harvey used not only pillows, but also plastic bags. To someone he administered large doses of morphine through a dropper, and used other medications to which he had access. And since he had no medical knowledge, some patients remained alive. One of them even accused the orderly of trying to kill him. But the hospital didn't believe him, and Harvey decided to punish the informer roughly and killed him in a rather cruel way. One night, taking advantage of the fact that the patient received a large share of painkillers and fell fast asleep, the serial killer pulled out his catheter and inserted a wire from a hanger into his vein. A few minutes later, Harvey returned everything back and left. The patient died a few days later from blood poisoning. Harvey's bloody career at Marymount ended on March 31, 1971. That day, the man got very drunk and tried to break into someone else's house. But he was detained by the police. "There's a maniac in the precinct." He began to ramble incoherently about the murders he had committed. The police considered it a common drunken delirium. But after the detainee sobered up, one of the detectives still questioned Harvey. He refused everything, the police had no other evidence, and the hospital orderly was sentenced to a fine for attempting to illegally enter someone else's house. Harvey was released, but questioning about the murders forced him to immediately quit his job and volunteer for the army. To serve a maniac got into the Air Force. But in less than a month, a year later, information reached the command of the unit where Harvey served that, being detained by the police, he confessed to the murders. And although no evidence of his confessions was found, the command of a unit hastened to get rid of the problematic soldier, counting him mentally unhealthy. After being discharged from the army in March 1972, Harvey became depressed. He tried to commit suicide, which is why his parents sent him to a psychiatric hospital. Harvey did not stay there for long. On August 25, 1972, he was discharged from there. Then a couple of weeks later, he tried to commit suicide again, but ended up in the hospital again. Donald Harvey was placed in a special security unit and underwent electroshock therapy for 21 days. He was released from a psychiatric hospital on October 17, 1972. Later, Harvey's mother would claim that it was psychiatrists were to blame for the fact that her cute boy turned into a maniac. As if missing the point that Harvey had already committed 13 murders before. Soon, he got another job as an orderly at Cardinal Hill Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. But he was not allowed close to the sick. After all, he was considered mentally unstable. Unable to kill, Harvey quits and gets a job at Fort Thomas Hospital. But even there he is trusted only with clerical work. After wandering around for almost 3 years at various jobs, Harvey returns to Cincinnati, where he successfully gets a job as a night nurse in one of the city's hospitals. Despite the fact that he did not provide letters of recommendation from his previous jobs, Harvey enjoys great confidence and immediately proceeds to what he can no longer live without: killing patients. However, this time the serial killer is acting more cautiously than during his activities in Marymount. He understands that too frequent deaths can attract too much attention. And because kills once or twice a year. Until 1985, he killed at least 15 hospital patients. And again, Harvey uses a variety of murder methods, such as strangulation with a plastic bag, pillow, or wet towel. The criminal poisons them with rat poison, mixing it into food. Then Harvey gets access to arsenic and cyanides, and instead of rat poison, the maniac uses more lethal drugs. And it introduces them into the body not only with food, but also through IVs. And sometimes he gives injections to patients himself. All this time, Harvey keeps a diary, where he meticulously records his observations of how he takes life and what symptoms he observed in the victims. In addition, the criminal constantly buys medical journals, from which he draws information on how to hide his crimes. And no one in the hospital is suspicious of sudden deaths. After all, this kind of thing happens in hospitals. In the early 80s, Donald Harvey's life took another turn. He got close to Carl Howler, his next, a lover. They even started living together. However, sometimes returning from work in the morning, Harvey found his partner in a state of alcoholic intoxication. The maniac became jealous of his lover and, so that he could not walk at night, began to mix small doses of arsenic into his food. By that time, the serial killer was already able to determine the doses well enough to poison, but not much. Harvey's new neighbors were also unlucky, who had a negative attitude to the fact that an unconventional couple lived next to them. A maniac gave one neighbor a drink of juice, which he mixed with hepatitis serum. Fortunately, the disease was quickly identified, and the woman survived. Another neighbor was less lucky. Harvey treated her to a pie with a lethal dose of rat poison. Howler's parents also reacted negatively to this union. And they constantly dripped on their son's brains so that he would break up with Harvey. In April 1983, Howler's father was hospitalized with a stroke. Harvey, I visited him there and treated him to a pudding with poison. The man died the following night. Surprisingly, all these poisonings did not arouse any suspicion. All 3 cases were attributed to natural causes. In early 1984, Howler announced that he was breaking up with Harvey, and kicked him out of his apartment. The abandoned lover devoted the next year to trying to kill Howler, his mother and the new girlfriend of a former friend. But not once did his attempts end in death. In July 1985, Harvey was stopped by hospital security guards. Suspicions were aroused by a sports bag with which he tried to go to the hospital, but refused to show the contents. However, I had to. A .38 caliber revolver, hypodermic needles, surgical scissors, gloves, several medical books and the biography of serial killer Charles Sobridge were found in the bag. In addition, a bag with prohibited substances was found in the bag. The hospital management decided not to take the trash out of the hut, and Harvey was simply fired. He was pushed around for several months without his favorite job. And in February 1986 he got a job again, work in a medical institution. This time to Drake Memorial Hospital. And although the hospital was located in the same Cincinnati, Harvey's past was not known there. For the next 13 months, Harvey continued to kill patients with impunity. During his time at Drake Hospital, he took his life, at least 23 people. To kill patients, the serial maniac still used strangulation, disabling life support systems, injected air into the veins and continued to poison patients with poisonous drugs. Cyanide of potassium eventually ruined him. After patients began to die frequently at Drake Hospital, pathologists began to study the causes of death more carefully. In April 1987, John Powell died unexpectedly. He was in a coma for a long time, but shortly before his death he regained consciousness and went on the mend. And suddenly he died. During the autopsy, the doctor caught a faint smell of almonds. This is how cyanide smells. Powell's blood and internal organs were sent to the forensic laboratory, where the examination clearly established that the patient was poisoned with potassium cyanide. Law enforcement agencies carefully checked Powell's surroundings, but no suspects were found. Switched to medical staff who had access to the patient. Among them was the orderly Harvey. Interested in this nurse, the police drew attention to the fact that in most cases, when patients died unexpectedly at Drake Hospital, Donald Harvey was necessarily in the immediate vicinity. The police obtained a search warrant for his apartment. During the search, jars of cyanide and arsenic, books on occultism and poisons, medical reference books were found. But most importantly, the police. They found Harvey's diary, in which he described his murders in detail. A maniac named Nurse, as the police called him, was arrested on April 6, 1987. Once behind bars, Harvey tried to pretend to be insane, which was greatly facilitated by his mother, who, as already mentioned, blamed the doctors who turned her son into a murderer. But several psychiatric examinations unequivocally summarized, Harvey is capable of being responsible for his actions. The 35-year-old criminal was seriously facing the death penalty, and he decided to make a deal with justice. The man confesses to his crimes, and the prosecutor promises not to insist on the death penalty. Realizing that everything was over for him on August 11, 1987, 35-year-old Donald Harvey confessed to investigators in 70 murders committed by him over 17 years. Then the figure rose to 87. But to find other evidence besides the confessions of the nurse, law enforcement agencies managed only 36 murders, 24 murders in Cincinnati and 12 murders in Kentucky. The trial of the maniac Donald Harvey began on August 18, 1987. He pleaded guilty to 24 aggravated murders committed in Cincinnati. As a result, the maniac was sentenced to several life terms of imprisonment. The trial in Kentucky began on September 7, 1987, where the criminal Donald Harvey was accused of committing 12 murders when he worked at Marymount Hospital. In October, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 8 life terms plus 20 years in prison. Harvey was incarcerated at the Toledo Correctional Institution, where he was taken on October 26, 1987. At the same time, the maniac, despite the huge deadlines, managed to glorify his name. On July 23, 2001, one of the newspapers published an article with a list of the worst serial killers in the history of the United States of America. Maniac Donald Harvey took the honorable first place in this rating, followed by no less famous scumbags John Wayne Gacy, Patrick Kearney, Bruce Davis, and Dean Corll. The maniac could have applied for early release in 2047, but the serial killer died on March 30, 2017, after being found beaten in his cell by cellmate James Elliott on March 28, 2017.